Hi, I'm Percy with the PSU Geology Department. You might know my work with geologic databases, web mapping, teaching GIS, and stuff like that, but I also hang out with the system science folks a lot. For those of you who don't know, system science encompasses cool stuff like neural networks, chaos theory, and cellular automata, the stuff that I like to call exotic computing. So I started working on this machine learning and data mining project before I finished my graduate degree there, and I've been working on it as a side project since then. Pictured here is the lattice of structures for a 4-variable system, graphically illustrating how it can be decomposed. I want to acknowledge my colleague and mentor, Marty Zwick, who's been instrumental in this work and with whom I hope to co-author a paper soon. There is the outline of where we're going. Unfortunately, I have no cool maps to show you today, but we will be talking about machine learning and data mining and satellite data and a little bit of RStudio and some results about forests. We got interested in the use of reconstructability analysis for raster data a few years ago when we realized that it hadn't been applied to truly spatial data as opposed to data that just comes from a spatial location. What if we use the inherent structure of raster data as the input to a machine learning model? And the distinguishing thing about reconstructability analysis is that it specializes in categorical or discrete data. And there's a data set that looks like categorical data called the National Land Cover Database. So this seems like the perfect blend of a technique needing a data set and a data set that's available for analysis. I've presented earlier versions of this work in system science settings, which I will summarize as needed while we progress through this project. The key finding that has tracked along since the beginning is that we might be picking up some anisotropy showing up as north-south or east-west influences in the data. In this current version of the work, we are pulling out just the Evergreen forest component and adding the time dimension. Machine learning and data mining are used in this project to analyze categorical raster data. This is a fairly recent application of reconstructability analysis to this particular data type, and today we present new results from a space-time data cube analysis. Reconstructability analysis is a robust data mining and machine learning procedure for analyzing discrete data. It actually only works on discrete data. And in order to analyze continuous data with this technique, we first need to put it in bins, like a histogram. Reconstructability analysis uses information theory and graph theory to construct simpler models of data that represent the data at whatever level of fidelity that we choose. We have many models to choose from and many criteria with which to decide on the best one. The RA procedure differs from many other machine learning procedures in that it is extremely transparent. We can open up the box and see exactly what is happening. If we had done this same analysis we are presenting today using a neural network, we would have most likely gotten very similar results for predicting outcomes. This neural network with like 15 hidden layers, however, would be entirely a black box that would yield nothing like the interesting results from this reconstructability analysis. We start with discrete data in the common form of observations in rows and attributes in columns. In this example, we are starting with 5 columns that are all categorical data. After our data are tidied up, we can add some header information about how many unique values are in each column and which column contains our dependent variable. All of the other columns will normally be the independent variables. We can turn variables on and off in the header. By examining the search output from Occam, we can determine which variables contribute more to the state of the dependent variable and keep those in the model. We can drop variables without altering the data by simply changing a parameter in the header file. Now that we have a set of variables to work with, we can use Occam to further refine the model. And once we have a model that is performing well, we can use the Occam fit model to run all of the data through the model and calculate a set of probabilities for every unique combination of states in the data. And with this unique set of states and conditional probabilities, we can begin to sift through the results and see what the model predicts. Back to our problem. Categorical or nominal data exist in the GIS world as classified layers of many varieties, such as soil types or vegetation classes. A commonly encountered layer is the satellite-derived National Land Cover Database, or NLCD. It is classified into the land uses you see here, such as forest or urban. NLCD is a complete coverage of the United States with a 30-meter grid size. This layer has been updated every 2 to 3 years since 2001. So for this study, we pulled out 2001, 2008, and the most recent year, 2016. I chose this study area in the Willamette Valley because it seemed to represent a good mix of land use types, and I live near there. It covers quite a large area and generates quite large data files. I have it overlaid on the same year of aerial photos streaming from the Oregon Imagery Service. The NLCD website has a lot of tools for exploring change over time. This one generates a report on change for the time period and geographic area of your choice. What we can see from this report is that the land use categories that changed most dramatically were evergreen forest, shrubs, and grassland. So now we need to extract the values from the raster, and in case it wasn't explicit before, we are taking the neighborhood around the target cell as the extra variables to use in the model. Normally you would drill down through layers to aggregate data. Here we are aggregating outwards. There are two neighborhoods that we talk about when discussing modeling in a raster world. At least this is what system scientists do, and they are the Moore and the von Neumann neighborhoods. These are familiar to some in the GIS world as well. We started by ripping the entire Moore neighborhood, since the von Neumann neighborhood is a subset of it. So we label each cell, A through I in this example, create a row of data out of the land class values in the raster, and add it to the table of data we are extracting for this NLCD layer. As noted, we used reconstructability analysis to determine that the variables in the von Neumann neighborhood are able to capture 88% of the information in this model. Since this is listed as a technical talk, I figured I get to show code. This is the original Python function I wrote to extract the neighborhood. It's pretty simple. It just takes an XY from the raster and goes -1 or +1 as it marches around the neighborhood, scooping up values and eventually dumping it out into a CSV. So that was the original routine. Now I had to figure out how to do this for multiple rasters, and this caused us to change the symbols. So now we have time epochs referred to as U, V, and W, where W is the most current time. And then we changed the cell names to make things cleaner. So this is the current working model, and we can see that a north-south orientation would be indicated by cells E and H, while an east-west orientation would be F and G. ZW is the cell in the model that we are concerned with. It is the dependent variable. All of the other spatiotemporal neighbors become columns in our database. It's kind of ironic to call them independent variables when we know that there's a lot of autocorrelation going on, but we continue. And here's some code to rip the space-time neighborhood. It features one of my favorite new things in ArcGIS Pro, the raster iterator, which made this whole process a lot easier since I didn't have to keep track of multiple files. I could just slurp up the entire neighborhood around the cell and dump it as a row to a file, which we remember is the format that Occam needs to see so that we can do reconstructability analysis. So here we define our 3 rasters, and then we can just run the little neighborhood extraction at each layer, A, B, and C, and aggregate the whole thing into a record. This ended up generating over 11 million records for this study area. Now that we have data, let's head over to our reconstructability analysis software called Occam. Occam runs on the web, and you upload your data file and choose whether to run a search to find models or a fit to look at the output of a specific model. Once your model has been submitted, you will get some report files sent back to you, which I recommend extracting out and pulling into RStudio for the analysis of results. And of course, looking at results raises more questions, so go try another model or tweak the data and try the model again. Now, what's actually happening in Occam that's somehow finding constraint between these categorical variables? This diagram, which I assume you will pause and look at for a minute or two later if you are interested in this method, has the original data for 3 variables A, B, and C in a table of counts. The projection step decomposes the data into subtables AB and BC. And the composition step reconstructs the original table by converting the counts into probabilities and using maximum entropy, which uses the equation p log p to generate the values representing the original data. This is the information theory part of the method, and anyone familiar with information theory will recognize that p log p. The output of the model is then checked against the original data using a variety of metrics in the step labeled evaluation. In our original analysis, we used the state of the ZW cell as the dependent variable and tried to predict that state based on the neighbors. And that could have been urban or water or anything, or well, any of the four classes. In order to get a stronger signal for the model, we decided to pull out one land class that changed and code it as loss, no change, or gain. In RStudio, I used the mutate command to add a column and populate it with values based on the values of ZU, the earlier epoch, and ZW, the final epoch. 42 in this case stands for forest, evergreen forest. So I took the 11 million rows into RStudio and immediately created a much smaller random sample to test things with. RStudio is very useful for the pre-processing of the data and the analysis of the results. I could have definitely done all of the pre-processing in Python, of course. I just chose R for convenience at the time. But for the analysis of results, RStudio is unsurpassed at this point. Here we see the code for adding the evergreen forest column and populating it with whether ZW and ZU are equal or not. V2 is ZU in this, and ZW is variable V12. Because Occam does better with fewer classes, and it's much easier to look at the output, we reclassified the data from 15 classes down to 4. We do this in the header of the file that we feed to Occam, so we don't have to actually modify the data to try out different reclassification schemes. There's a snippet of header down at the bottom for reference. And finally, some results. Now, the output from Occam's fit method is a list of every unique combination of rows in your data and a set of conditional probabilities that predict the outcome for that row of data. I'm not showing the conditional probabilities. I already made your eyes glaze over by showing Python code and R code. So I've translated these conditional probabilities into prose statements with percentages attached. The model predictions match the data within a few percentage points except where noted. In these cases, the model is typically more conservative in its predictions. Keep in mind that we are predicting the state of the evergreen forest using just the neighbor cells. We have excluded the most predictive variable, which is the previous state, ZU. Here we see a few key findings from some of the simpler models. In model GUGV, it is the cell to the east for 2 previous time periods, and if it changes from forest to grass, the center cell has a 66% probability of forest loss. If it stays a forest, there's still a 27% chance of loss. But if it changes from grasses to forest, then look out, there's a forest coming. In the next model, using the best 3 components from the system, we see that either grass or urban encroaching leads to forest loss, and forest just sitting there with no change around, it still has a 30% chance of loss. And in the 4-component model, we can see dynamics of changing forest to grass are captured in the model. As reported in the simplest model, no change in forest still leads to about a 30% loss of forest, and this is borne out in the more complex models as well. We have more work to do with these NLCD 2016 data in terms of looking for actual spatial effects. We want to try east-west models versus north-south models, for example, to see if encoding these data this way yields interesting results. I think that this approach could be used for meteorological data if we bin the numeric data into quartiles and then literally treat the layers of ocean temperature, air pressure, etc. as layers in the raster data cube. The advantage of this approach over purely numeric approaches would be that Occam can discover nonlinear relationships in the data. Also, the probabilities that we are calculating could be used as the transition rules in a cellular automata model of land use change. The trick would be to figure out how to smear the probability of transition out over time. All right, so that's a data mining and machine learning with reconstructability analysis talk disguised as a GIS talk. I hope that you consider this technique if you have categorical data to analyze. The approach I demonstrated here is far more complicated than a typical analysis might be. For example, you would just lay an event theme like landslides on top of the categorical layers like soils, veg, and slope, and drill down through the stack to generate rows of data for analysis with Occam. Boom! Thanks.